Okay, let's get the show on the road. Let's get going. Okay, now we've been discussing challenges in technology. There have been a series of questions that I've been asked over the past couple months, and I just sort of put them all together to create a series of classes. But the class that we're going to be discussing tonight is probably the most pertinent, and it's most important, and it's also filled with the greatest number of pitfalls, misnomers, and mistaken impressions. We're going to be talking about Shabbos modes on ovens today. That's going to be what we're going to be discussing. And we're going to be discussing also the great Shabbos oven controversy. There are two parts to the class. One part is the controversy that has to do with a decision that Rabbi Heinemann promulgated about 15 years ago. But what we're going to we're going to start off, however, talking about the purpose of a Shabbos mode on an oven. What exactly is it? What purpose does it serve? So let's take a step back or so. On Shabbos, there are various labors that you're not allowed to perform. This, pretty rudimentary stuff. We're all familiar with this. And I think also just about everyone who'd be attending the class is familiar with the idea of bishul, which is cooking. You're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. So the cooking is a bit of a misnomer. What exactly is the word bishul and what does it come to include? So bishul can be defined as causing a change in any product, changing its properties, changing it in one way or another through the introduction of heat. So it doesn't only include cooking raw food. So for example, you can take a potato, stick it in an oven, and through the application of heat, you've now changed it. You've made it edible. But cooking also applies to non-edible items, things like wax, melting wax. You're now turning an item that was a solid, you're transferring it into a liquid state so that it can now be used. You can now use it to seal things. It has a greater application than perhaps it did before. You're affecting a change, a qualitative change in a product through the introduction of heat. We consider that to be a form of bishul as well. Additionally, we could say the same thing about heating up metal, turning metal hot to the degree that it becomes soft, pliable. It's now usable. You've affected a change in the metal, and it's now usable for a different purpose. That's also considered to be a form of cooking. We consider that to be bishul as well. It's actually a discussion. This is a bit of a digression. This is a bit of a tangent. I think I mentioned this in one of the previous classes. But the Chazon Ish was of the opinion that heating up metal is considered cooking, even if it doesn't get soft. So according to the Chazon Ish, you can't even put a blech down on Shabbos for the purposes of reheating food because you're starting the cooking process by heating up the metal. Now, we obviously, in North America, that's not the accepted practice. And when it comes to metal, it has to be heated up to a much greater degree in order for it to be considered cooking. Just exposing it to heat is not a problem. But when it comes to food in general, that still is the case. Introducing a product to heat to make it edible constitutes a prohibited malacha on Shabbos. Okay, now with that out of the way, what about reheating foods? If I take a soup, for example, or if I take a cold cup of tea or a cup of coffee and I expose it to heat, I put it down next to an oven or next to a stove, or I put it on a radiator, is that cooking? Here's actually where you get a difference between Ashkenazi practice and Sephardi practice. Ashkenazim observe what's called yesh bishul acher bishul for a davar lach. That essentially means that if something was cooked and it was liquid and it cools down, heating it up again constitutes another act of cooking. That cold cup of coffee or that cold chicken soup, rather, that's a better example. When it's hot, it's great, it's edible. Everybody loves warm or hot chicken soup. Nobody likes cold chicken soup. It's no longer doesn't have the same quality. You've now made it beneficial again. You've now made it a better product by heating it again. So Ashkenazim are of the practice that there is a form of cooking after cooking when it comes to liquid items. So as such, that bowl of soup cannot be put on a radiator. It can't be put next to a stove. It can't be put next to an oven. You can't do any of these things because that's considered to be cooking once again. Sfardim have a different practice, but that's the Ashkenazi custom. That's Ashkenazi observance of Shabbos. Now that's true about liquid food? What about reheating dry cooked food? Well, even Ashkenazim are of the opinion that that is not considered cooking. If I have a potato that was in the oven, it was cooked, it's not been completely edible, and it was put in the refrigerator. And on Shabbos morning, I said, you know what? I'm really in the mood for a potato before shul, and I stick it on the radiator. I would that would be considered completely acceptable. That would be considered completely fine because we rely on the rule that says "Ein bishul acher bishul." There's no such thing as there's no cooking after an item was cooked. So for liquid items, reheating it constitutes an act of bishul on Shabbos, which is biblically prohibited. When it comes to a dry item, you are allowed to heat it up. You are allowed to, expose it to heat, and we do not consider that to be cooking. So that would mean, for example, that if I have boiled noodles and they're cold, they're in the refrigerator, but I like having chicken soup with lokshen. I like having noodles in my soup, and I have a hot in the in the crock pot, I have chicken soup. I can take those cold noodles and put them into the bowl of hot chicken soup, and that would not be considered cooking. The soup was already hot. That's not a problem. The noodles were already cooked. No issue, no problem. And that really is almost the final word, at least when as far as the prohibition against cooking on Shabbos goes. But that said, while it's permissible to place certain previously cooked foods, as we've just said, near sources of heat, there is still a prohibition against putting a previously cooked item into an oven or on a stovetop. What's the problem there? Well, it looks like cooking. It's a concept called mechze kimivashel. Under no circumstances can a person take a tray of chicken, can a person take a challah, can a person take that potato and stick it in an oven. Not only that, but a person cannot take that potato, cannot take that kugel or whatever the case may be, and put it on a stovetop, even if there was a blech. Because you're still dealing with a stovetop, people cook on stovetops, putting items that were previously cooked into a scenario where they will be reheated, even if it's not considered cooking, since it's being done in the manner in which food is normally cooked, it's subject to the rabbinic prohibition of mechze k'mevashel. We call that chazara, or returning an item to the place of cooking. So that is never permitted. Platas are different because people don't cook on platas. So putting food on a blech, on a plata, is fine. Putting food on top of a pot that's on a stovetop is also fine because that's not how people cook. But to put something in an oven and to put something on the stovetop, even on a blech, is problematic, la halacha, because it looks like cooking. And that is universally true. That is the case, and no Shabbos mode oven will ever change that reality. You're not allowed to put the food back into the oven on a Shabbos afternoon. So again, on a Shabbos afternoon, you want to reheat your kugel, you can't put it into your oven, even if there's a Shabbos mode in place. So then you might ask me the question, well, Rabbi, then what's the purpose of the Shabbos mode? What exactly does it do? What purpose does it serve? And there are two purposes that the Shabbos mode serves. We're going to talk about the least controversial one first. And that has to do with something that we touched on earlier. And that has to do with the thermostat within the oven. Often, we spoke about, for example, opening a refrigerator door. If you open a refrigerator door, we said you're allowed to do it. We'll come back to this idea in a moment. You're allowed to open the refrigerator door because even though you're causing the cold air to leave the refrigerator, warm air is coming into the refrigerator, which is going to trigger the thermostat, which is going to start the condenser. Yes, that is a train of events that might happen on a Shabbos. We still say you're not prohibited from opening the refrigerator because we call that a grumma. It's considered an indirect action. There is a period of time in between when the action is performed and the result is achieved. So opening up the refrigerator door does not constitute a problem. With newer ovens, however, the thermostat is so trigger happy, it detects drops in temperature with such great sensitivity Newer ovens, this isn't a problem with older ovens, but newer ovens will actually kick in either the gas or they'll restart the heating element if they're off every time you open the oven door. So what does the Shabbos mode do? It changes how the thermostat functions in terms of how it reads temperature and how it uses that to determine when to start the juice up again. So a Shabbos mode on an oven does not allow you to take a challah and put it into the oven once Shabbos has begun. What the Shabbos mode oven allows you to do is open the refrigerator door and take out that challah that you put in the oven before Shabbos began. So your tray of chicken, your roast beef, your potatoes, your fish, whatever the case may be, the Shabbos mode on your oven allows you to open the door and remove something that was placed there before Shabbos, but what it does not allow you to do is put something in there on Shabbos. The Shabbos mode removes the direct interaction between the opening of the door and the start of the start of the heating element within the oven. Some ovens have lights that turn on. You can perhaps, you can just time when you open the door for when the light is on, so that that they have a little indicator light saying that the heating element has been turned on. So you don't necessarily have to have a Shabbos mode with some of those ovens. But in general, the reason why we have a Shabbos mode is to ensure that the opening of the door is permitted on Shabbos. That allows you to take out the food that was there from before, but not to put the stuff in on Shabbos itself. That's right. Yeah, that right exactly. That's and that's that's sort of that's a corollary to the point that is that when you're opening the door, you're affecting all sorts of electronic systems. The most serious one, if you recall, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said a lot of those things don't really count. The one that's most important is the heating element because that's the biblical one, and other ones are perhaps rabbinic, perhaps not even. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's true. The most important one is the burning of the heating element or the burning of the gas. But you're right. You want to shut off all those sensors. What's that? Those on like a halogen light, there's no ground. As soon as you open the door, where? Yeah, that's that. Yeah. Well, we're saying that opening an oven door is also like not a grum. It's too the interaction is too direct to say that it's a knock-on effect. It looks like it's considered an immediate cause and effect. Um, but you're right. So just the long and short of it is you can't put food into your oven on Shabbos. You can't put food onto your stovetop on Shabbos. You can put food on a plata on Shabbos. That's definitely not an issue at all. Um, it's a hot plate. Like you do like a heating plate. So that's how we heat up the kugel here on Shabbos morning. I have because there are kids everywhere in the shul. They go into the kitchen, they go into the back. The only place kids don't go is into my office. When I come here on a Saturday morning, when we're serving kugel, I'll go into the kitchen and grab the kugels and put them on the plata. There's a blech already put out on the heating plates, and I just put the kugels out. And I'm allowed to do that. Again, I'm not putting on a stovetop or an oven because people don't cook on heating plates. They're similar. They're similar to a plata. It really does depend on how hot they get and what they're used for. It really it's depends on the situation and the kind of heating drawer that you have. But they're largely the same. People don't cook in heating drawers, and putting them back might be okay if you can finagle a blech. The problem with heating drawers is that you have to have a blech. What does a blech do? It creates a degree of separation between the source of the heat or the place where the food is normally cooked and where the food is actually being placed on the Shabbos. We have to make that separation to distinguish it um, from regular cooking. It's still something that has to be done. And heating drawers can be problematic. There are workarounds, but it's not as simple as just sort of putting a blech down, though. It really does depend on how they work. It depends on the heating drawer. If you want me to come by and take a look at your heating drawer. In Houston, they were trying to set communal standards on. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's always no, that's always a nightmare. Okay, but there's another kind of Shabbos mode oven that you might have heard about, and it became all the rage, or at least all the talk of the town or the Jewish world overall in 2008. So in 2008, what's that?
When we redid our kitchens.
Uh, so in 2008, it saw a pronouncement from leading halachic authorities, leading poskim from both in Israel and in North America about pressing buttons on a Shabbos mode oven. There was a permissive ruling that had been issued by Rabbi Moshe Heinemann, who's the rabbinic administrator, who's the Rav HaMachshir, if you want to use the halachic nomenclature, for the Star K, the kashrus agency based out of Baltimore. We're going to present his rulings based on what's on their website, what I saw printed, as well as what other people have said in response. And we're going to be discussing it. But in order to understand what exactly he was saying, in order to discuss what his halachic opinion was, we have to take a step back and discuss grumma once again. So what exactly is a grumma? We're going to talk about it a little bit more. We're going to lay it out a little bit more clearly now. The Torah tells us what lo sa'asa kol melacha. Don't do any melacha. The way that word is constructed, the way that verse is sort of is built, the Gemara in Shabbos tells us that I am not allowed to do melacha. I'm not allowed to do work. However, if I do work indirectly, that's not subject to a biblical prohibition. So seemingly what the Torah is saying is that I can't do work, but I can do work indirectly. What's a classic example of indirect work? This is the example that I use because it's the easiest one for people to track. Let's imagine for a moment I'm out in the front of the house of Jacob and I want to water the grass. But I know that it's Shabbos, so I'm not going to do it directly. So if I take a hose or if I take a cup of water and pour it onto the cement right in the front, and the cement allows the water to run off the pavement and onto the grass, that would not be a biblical prohibition of watering the grass because I did not directly pour water on the grass. I poured the water in point A, and the water made its way on its own to point B, eventually getting the flowers, whatever the case, whatever it is that I'm trying to water. So that's the classic example of a grumma. Now, the Torah seems to be saying that it's permitted, while obviously, we're talking about it, so it's not that simple. So where did we discuss grummas in the past? We discussed it in the context again of opening up a refrigerator door. You're opening up the door, and even though you're causing the condenser to start working, it's considered to be indirect because there are too many steps and it doesn't happen immediately. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was the author of that opinion, who says you're allowed to open a refrigerator on Shabbos. But what did he say? He said the reason why it's permitted is because it was never your intent to start the condenser up. It's a grumma with an unintended result. That's where he says a grumma is permitted. But if it's my intended result that for example, I want the flower to be watered, then the grumma is prohibited rabbinically. There's a rabbinic prohibition. Now, why would there be a rabbinic prohibition against a grumma? Well, because as we're gonna get into the weeds of this momentarily. Well, because it's possible to live your entire Shabbos existence, keeping Shabbos according to the letter of the law, but not observing the Shabbos meaningfully. I could do everything that I want to do through the mechanism of the grumma, through the indirect action. We can finagle ways, as we're going to see, that can make it that I can do anything that I want, and break any Shabbos rule and say, it's okay, it's a grumma, it's an indirect action.
Oh, goodness.
It's all right, exactly. So it's subject to a rabbinic prohibition. There's several different considerations here, and this will become a little bit more important later on. That is, not doing something because it's not in the spirit of Shabbos is considered to be of a lesser worry than an actual rabbinic prohibition that was put into effect in order to preserve the spirit. There are two different imperatives. One is to preserve the spirit, which is a little bit less severe, and the other one is muktzah, for example, or some of the other things we've been discussing, like putting food into an oven on Shabbos. That's considered to be a much more severe prohibition than preserving the spirit of Shabbos, which is also it also is an imperative, but it doesn't have the same sort of legal heft. Well, that's a little bit off topic. Let's get back to this. Okay, now We do find, however, that grumma can be permitted under other circumstances. Rav Shlomo Zalman said if the grumma is not the desired effect, then it's permitted. The Gemara tells us the following. Let's imagine for a moment that there is a fire coming down the path. It's burning up the grass on the side of the road. And I have my wagon full of my wares, and I'm on the road to the market. It happens to be Shabbos right now, but I'm not traveling. But I camped out on the side of the road, and there's this fire that's coming. I'm allowed, according to the Gemara, to take a giant barrel, put it in the path of the fire, so that when the fire reaches the barrel will burst and put the fire out. That's considered to be a grumma. It's an indirect action. I have not acted on the fire. I have put a situation in place that the fire will be extinguished, but I'm not the one acting to extinguish the fire. The Gemara, it's very clear there, according to the halachic authorities, that that's not a situation where somebody's life was in danger. If somebody's life is in danger, you're obviously allowed to break the Shabbos without any reservation whatsoever. Not a problem. So what's the consideration over there? The consideration is, according to the halachic authorities, I'm trying to prevent a financial loss. Grumma is permitted to prevent a very serious financial loss. So let's talk about some of the halachic applications, because this actually comes up quite a bit in Israel. We're very fortunate. We live here in North America. We don't live in some ways, we're fortunate that we don't live in a Jewish society, and we also don't live primarily on farms. But what do you do if you have a farm and you are a dairy farmer and you have a whole herd of cows that, if they don't get milk today, are going to be in absolute agony? A, B, you're going to lose probably the financial viability of your farm. So what do you do? The Chazon Ish gives the out. He gives the solution. The Chazon Ish says that you can rely on a grumma. Again, it's that consideration that it's an indirect action. I'll explain what it is. It's an indirect action in a situation of financial loss coupled with pain and suffering of animals. So what is his option? What does he suggest? He suggests having your milking machines that are on a timer, so that they're completely disconnected from the electrical grid. You attach them to the udders of the cow just before the timer clicks in, turns it on, and then Bob's your uncle. You have your cow that's being milked. When you acted to attach the udders to the cow, you were not milking the cow. The the machine is like that barrel in that the electricity is not yet here. It's not functioning. It's not present. You have created the situation where the malacha will be performed in the future, but the ability to perform it is not present right here, right now. So the Chazon Ish says that is a practical example of a grumma, of an indirect action, where you're not necessarily doing the malacha. You're setting it up so that the malacha will be done later on, but we're allowing the individual to do that to protect against a financial loss and to protect the animal from pain and suffering. That's one example of where grumma comes up in a contemporary context, where we rely on it under these circumstances. Again, we don't rely on it on all circumstances, but we rely on it here. Another example, a timer. Let's say I have a timer. Not all timers work this way, but let's say I have one of those timers, with the pins that come out and that go in. It's possible, according to the Shmira Shabbos Golchasa says, that if the timer is working towards turning a light on, you can modify the time, either making the light turn on earlier or later, and that's only considered to be a grumma, because you're only setting up the light to turn on later on. The electricity is not actually working through the timer to the light. You're not directly affecting the light. That's considered to be a grumma, and that would be permitted in situations of great need. So imagine for a moment if we had a situation here at the shul where the light was off, the timer wasn't set correctly, and we were not going to be able to daven Ma'ariv because it's just too dark in Calgary. We would allow the grumma in some circumstances to facilitate changing the time on the timer so that the light can be turned on. Not all timers are okay. Sometimes only some timers specifically. So, right. So it's a little bit complicated. I'm quoting the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa. This is not a universal opinion. Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Rav, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University held, you cannot touch a timer ever. I'm just using this as an example of showing how we can rely where perhaps it can be applied in a contemporary context that you'd be familiar with. Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik was of the opinion that a timer, since it is actually functioning, it may not be on, but the timer is functioning, it's on. That's not the grumma any longer. You're actually changing the functioning of an electronic appliance. So, he doesn't look at the timer separately from the light. He says the whole thing is just one big structure, electronic appliance. It's working, it's functional. You can't separate the two. You're affecting it. Can't do that on Shabbos. But there is one example, the gramophone. So in the Israeli military, we're not talking about life-threatening situations, because if it's a life-threatening situation, obviously you turn on your phone and you use regular communication devices. But there is a gramophone, which operates in a similar manner to other Somet products, which essentially means that this is how it works. When you raise the receiver, there's no electric circuit that's being completed. It's checking every 10 seconds to see if there's been any change in the phone, and modifies how it operates as a consequence. That's a grumma. If I'm picking it up and I'm not affecting a change, rather I'm picking it up and it will change on its own perhaps as a consequence, but I'm not directly affecting the change. That is considered to be a grumma, and that's how some electric appliances work that they rely on in the Israeli military in non-life-threatening situations. Essential situations, you can't just do this on a lark, but in essential situations, but in non-life-threatening situations. Yeah. Right. So yeah, the Somet Institute has a whole bunch of wheelchairs and other electric appliances, but they make them for people who are unwell where their needs. I can't just say, I feel like riding on a scooter to shul today. I can't just do that. There has to be it has to be a legitimate need. It's not on a lark. Mhm. So these are all contemporary examples of where we rely on grumma. And again, grumma is an indirect action. I'm not directly affecting the item itself. I'm setting it up, and whatever it is happening on its own. But I'm not the one who's actually affecting the change, the desired outcome. Um, and as a result, we say that in cases of financial loss or in other cases of essential need, we permit it, but it's not permitted normally. It's not permitted regularly. So let's get now that we sort of have a much broader understanding of what a grumma is. Again, it's that indirect action where I'm not pushing a button, but I'm doing something, and then the item detects on its own in a period of time later on that something has changed, and therefore it changes how it operates. That's a grumma. Let's talk about Rav Heinemann's halachic decision. Rav Heinemann argues that that's only on Shabbos that there has to be a need. On Yom Tov, however, grumma is always permitted. He argues that grumma is always permitted, and he bases this ruling on something the Ramah says. The Ramah says that on Yom Tov, I'm allowed to take a candle and put it by a window in order to blow it out, as long as at the time that I put it down, there's no wind blowing. The question the commentators ask, well, isn't that only permitted under situations of need? That's a grumma. I'm putting it in a situation where something is going to happen. But why is there no qualification? That's only where there's an essential need for that to happen. And the answer that some of the halachic authorities is, well, because that's talking about Yom Tov, not talking about Shabbos. And as a result, according to those authorities, and Rav Heinemann decides this way, and again, it's by no means universal, but Rav Heinemann decides this way, that in fact, that is the case. On Yom Tov, grumma is always permitted. So Rav Heinemann applies this to an oven that is modified with a special Shabbos mode. Not all ovens have this Shabbos mode, but there are some Starkei Shabbos mode ovens that have adjustments made with a random time delay feature, so that you can push the keypad, change the temperature on the thermostat, and since nothing happens immediately, it takes either between 15 and 25 to 30 seconds before it actually kicks in, it's just sort of monitoring to see if there have been any changes in the settings from somebody having pushed the button. That's enough to be considered a grumma, and Rav Heinemann permits pressing these keys on Yom Tov under all circumstances because he believes that grumma is permitted under all circumstances on Yom Tov. So again, for our purposes, for what we've been saying, according to Rav Heinemann, you're not allowed to stick that kugel into the oven on Shabbos. Once Shabbos has begun, you can't stick it into the oven, even on a Shabbos mode. Shabbos mode allows you to open the door of the oven without worrying about setting off all the sensors and turning on the heating element, so on and so forth. He also says that there's a special Shabbos mode that allows you to modify the temperature of the oven, but that's only on Yom Tov. Yes, well, of course, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. That was never an issue. Like people say, it looks like you're cooking. Of course, it looks like you're cooking. You're allowed to. That's not a problem.
But it's a misnomer, essentially. It's not Shabbos mode, functionally. It's Yom Tov mode.
Well, for the purposes of modifying the temperature, that's the case. But for all the other purposes, it's right. But they don't have like separate Yom Tov and Shabbos mode, and they have a limited amount of space usually on the screen or
580.
Yeah.
right.
Well, if you look up Sabbath mode, try to figure out how to turn it on your oven. There's a bunch of people going, like my oven has a 5AB error and I can't figure out how to turn it on.
Right. Yeah. Anywho, so that's Rav Heinemann's opinion, but Rav Heinemann's ruling spawned a flurry of rulings, for many top-level poskim in North America and in the United States. This includes like people, if you know your rabbis, Rav Yosef Shalom Elyashiv, Rav Moshe Sternbach, Rav Shmuel Wosner in Israel, Rav Yisrael Belsky from the OU here in North America, Rav Feivel Cohen, who's some person who I discuss halacha with quite frequently, Rav Shmuel First, who's the person I got my smicha from, Rabbi Mordechai Willig, Rosh Hashiva of Yeshiva University. They all disagree with Rav Heinemann. According to what we say, Rav Soloveitchik said that, an appliance, if it's operating, it's never a grumma. Like, you're changing an appliance, how it operates. It's you can't separate different parts of it. You're modifying an electronic appliance. So that was never a grumma, according to him anyways. But even according to those who don't agree with that point of view and say that you can argue a form of grumma here, they would actually say that Rav Heinemann here presents some very serious problems. Rav Sternbach in particular seems to be very concerned about grumma on Yom Tov. He says there are so many electronic appliances that can be modified to become grumma appliances. According to Rav Heinemann's psak, if you take it to its logical conclusion, you can use that Somet grumma phone not to call your commander when you're worried about a chifetz chashud. Now you have to, you're feeling lonely and you want to talk to your friend, you want to talk to your buddy. According to Rav Sternbach, it's an untenable position because you can modify just about any electronic appliance and completely remove the observance of Yom Tov from the equation, which is something we'd rather not do. Moreover, the idea that halacha, that it grants unfettered licenses to perform grumma on Yom Tov, doesn't seem to be supported by previous generations of poskim. You take a look at, for example, the Shmir Shabbos Kalachasa, which is a primary work on Shabbos observance. You take a look at the Tzomid Institute. None of them permit the use of their appliances or extend a permission for grumma under all circumstances on Yom Tov. It just doesn't seem to be a position that is prevalent in terms of practice. It's not a universally held one. There still has to be some kind of need in order to rely on a grumma, even on Yom Tov. So while it's true that Rav Heinemann and the Star K, which are very highly respected, both he as an individual, as a Rav, as a posek, and the Star K as a halachic organization and a kashrus agency, it's a very controversial position that he takes that doesn't seem to align with the consensus of halachic authorities. And depending on, I usually sort of cater my halachic responses to people ask me to who they are, their circumstances. I don't recommend in broad strokes. If you're facing some individual challenges, please by all means talk to me about it. But in broad strokes, I do not encourage people to adopt Rav Heinemann's position just because it really does place you out of step with the predominant norms of Yom Tov observance. Yeah, I find myself in it. Perhaps I'm going to just pause the recording.
So the
Right.
specific thing that is controversial is the adjusting of the temperature. That's the
Yes.
main crux of it, right?
Yes, exactly. Correct. It's the adjusting of the temperature that's problematic. But just about everything else seems to be pretty universal. Nothing. I do not believe anything I've said is controversial in any way. It would put me sort of out of the bounds of sort of.
But it's not specifically just with temperature, it's doing it by digital means. Like if it was an oven that had a analog knob, you would be allowed to, depending on the electric mechanism.
Yes.
You would.
Well, it would be to you. It's yeah to.
You weren't very line.
You would be allowed to. You're allowed to stoke fire. Like you'd be allowed to increase it.
So
Yeah.
it's actually not an issue. It has nothing to do with the oven itself. It has to do with the
How it
with
works.
digital. Yeah, with whatever's going on behind the scenes
Yeah.
inside the.
Well, it's also lowering the temperature. It's a lot on Yom Tov. It's even with sort of like the analog, the controls, depending on how they work. They're different kinds. You would be able to increase the temperature. Lowering the temperature is always a little bit more complicated. Yeah, right, whatever. But here, according to Refinement, it's you don't even have to have that. You don't have to reckon with any of that.
It's not analog. There's no risk it will turn on. So
Yeah.
it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Yeah, yeah. It's
But it's not. So the issue is not actually. It has nothing to do with it being an oven.
that's broadly speaking correct. Yes, it's more to do with the electronic mechanisms within the oven, how they work.
Just have digital systems work.
Yeah.
A pulse that checks every X seconds automatically.
Right. So
switch. So it's actually more like the pins in the.
yeah, it can be.
Effectively like because the way switches work is they're basically like they work the same as the pins in the timer.
Yeah, admittedly, I'm not super up to date with all the recent developments in the changes in behind the hood in the oven. Really, it's I think, well, broadly speaking, you're right. It has more to do with the digital systems that you have to be worried that you'd be concerned about, as opposed to
Yeah, I'm sorry, she still doesn't agree, but if it was like instead of like digital buttons, it was just mechanical pins that one could be pressed in at a time. That pin completes the circuit.
It depends.
There's some timer that checks every 1 minute or whatever
Right.
it is.
Yeah.
And so
I think that's though the Shabbos mode ovens are sort of even if they're not operating that way, they switch to a mechanism to a system where it operates that way.
That's basically what's going on behind the switch is basically the equivalent.
Yeah,
of a pin
I've often
had
had a very difficult time with refinement stock just in general, because if you push a button in there and the desired outcome is happening, even if there's a delay, it's working as intended. It's not it's very difficult for me to conceptually say that this is an indirect action. It's a convoluted action, but it's still
he's going by the fact that says
yeah.
You just need to delay. You put the
Yeah.
in the window, so he's relying on that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But to my mind, it's a very it's
like if you know a wind comes every 1 minute, there's like a bus passes every minute, so you're gonna put the candle in front of the window.
Yeah, but I think it's a little bit more involved here. I mean, you're pushing a button and you're changing how an appliance is operating.
He's saying that's exactly the same as putting.
Yeah, I know that's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. That's definitely what he's saying. I'm just saying I have a hard time sort of.
Like I know the Star K allows it, and our oven allows it, but it's always been very like something about it feels like you really are intending for it to do that, and therefore it's doing exactly what you want, exactly as you said.
Yeah.
Either part of if it was a mechanical switch, it somehow seems like it would be more allowable than if it's a touchpad.
I think so, absolutely. I absolutely think so. I would be much more comfortable with it if it was all sort of mechanical. I do like typewriters.
But I think functionally the way those digital panels actually work the same as a mechanical switch. There's behind it, there's like a memory and a little button.
You're the engineer, you know more about that than I do. I can talk with the complexities of Groma. You can tell me about how it works. We all have our expertise. I believe you. You're the I absolutely think that what you're saying is correct.
I guess it also probably comes down to some different definitions of what you're allowed to do electrically on Shabbat.
Yeah, and that was something we did discuss in one of the previous classes that there's this very expansive spectrum of opinion where Shlomo Zalman is super lenient, and you have the Chazonish saying that you're over an Isser Deraisa, like you have.
If it works effectively on static electricity, is that less of a problem than working on?
Gosh, I don't know.
That's true. It's makes it fun.
Yeah, I don't know.
Some more meds, and let's keep going.
Well, let's go off on a bit of a tangential topic because this is actually something that I was super interested in looking into. Okay, do we have to turn off our website on Shabbos?
Oh, the fucking-
Yeah.
Less someone click on it, like you're saying.
So what are the considerations that would say yes, and what are the considerations that would say no? So we're gonna parse this out. What are some of the reasons that you would be obligated to perhaps? Well, that's one part of it. We'll get to it. So there's a concept called shvisas kalim, which is an idea that not only am I obligated to rest, um, am I obligated to ensure that my stuff is also at rest, that nothing of mine is desecrating the Shabbos. For example, the Torah says, like, what does the Torah say? The Torah says that that you're prohibited from doing malacha. That's you, your children, your slaves, your animals. I'm not allowed to. Okay, I'm not plowing the field. I'm also not allowed to have my ox plow the field, even if I'm not the one doing it. My animals also have to be at rest on Shabbos. Am I allowed to set up a trap before Shabbos? Um, and then would I have transgressed Shabbos if an animal wanders into that trap? And so it's an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So Beis Shammai says that my utensils have to be at rest. My computer has to be off. Whatever it is that a computer does when somebody is accessing our website, and you can start getting the questions about like where the server is. Is it mine? Is it somebody else's? Yeah, we're gonna do this old school, the 1990s, and the internet is in our home, and the server is in our office. According to Beis Shammai, I probably would have to do that because there's change. The my utensils are being used for Shabbos. However we're going to classify electricity, use of electric appliances. My utensils are being used as electric appliances on Shabbos, and they're changing in how they're operating. They're working differently because they're being accessed. According to Beis Shammai, that would be forbidden. According to Beis Hillel, however, which is how we paskin, no, my utensils do not have to be at rest, right? I'm allowed to, for example, have a timer that's set up to turn on a light. That's not a problem. We'll talk about timers. Exactly. That would be the knock-on effect. We say no. So no, we are not obligated to turn off our computers even if somebody's going to access something on Shabbos. Now, okay, that's makes sense about just accessing and reading what the rabbi's Dvar Torah for the week, seeing the bulletin or finding out what davening times are. Okay, fine. That would be I'm not under any obligation to turn it off. Other people shouldn't be accessing it, but I'm not under any obligation to turn off the computer. What about, as Marina brought up, what about Mekach Umemker? What about sales? What happens if I have an online store? No, obviously most people are selling it through third parties, is not through your own computer. But again, we're in the 1990s. Um, um, is there any consideration there? Would there be any problem? So there are prohibitions against conducting business on Shabbos and Yom Tov, right? I'm not allowed to make a business deal. And so uh, probably, well, I'm not making a business deal on Shabbos, so probably that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if a trade were to take place on Shabbos. However, there is something interesting. This comes up when Pesach is on a Saturday night, when you have to sell the chametz. When we fill out the forms, or when the rabbi is making the sale document, we we perform the act of acquisition with the non-Jew, but the act of acquisition doesn't necessarily come into effect at the time that the agreement is made. It comes into effect at a later point. Rabbi Kiva Eger says, I cannot sell the chametz on Thursday and have the sale go into effect on Shabbos. He says that runs afoul of that prohibition against doing business on Shabbos. I'm not actually doing anything on Shabbos. Rabbi Kiva Eger says, well, that would still run afoul of that rabbinic prohibition of doing business on Shabbos by scheduling some kind of exchange, some kind of acquisition to go into effect on Shabbos. Possibly that would also preclude having a business website that operates on Shabbos because I'm setting something up for commerce to take place on Shabbos itself, right? Even though they're not purchasing, the item doesn't become theirs, their money gets transferred to my account and it's through my computer in my office. Is that running afoul of that opinion of Rabbi Kiva Eger, who says that I can't even set up a situation where the acquisition would take place on Shabbos? The halachic authorities say no, doesn't apply to a website. Why not? Because Rabbi Kiva Eger only talks about where you've scheduled that exchange to take place, where that exchange and that change in title, you're scheduling it for Shabbos. Here, I'm not scheduling it. It's happening on its own. Somebody else is deciding to do it. I have not run afoul of that prohibition because I personally have not scheduled it for that time. What about schar Shabbos? If I have a home, for example, I'm renting out a room. I am not allowed to rent out a room and receive payment for Shabbos. I'm allowed to do it for an entire week. That includes a Shabbos, but I cannot rent out a room for a day, 2 days, 3 days at a per day rate and receive money for the Shabbos payment. Am I perhaps now running afoul of that by having my computer remain on and commerce is now operating and I'm receiving payment on Shabbos? So the answer is still no. When do we say that I'm not allowed to receive payment for something on Shabbos? That's for services rendered. For services that are not rendered, rather, collecting on a good that was received, that is not a problem, at least as far as schar Shabbos goes. For example, let's imagine that I want to use the mikveh on a Shabbos morning. Men use the mikveh Shabbos morning. Sometimes they do. And I live in a community where I'd have to pay for it. Would the mikveh now be precluded from receiving payment for me using the mikveh on a Shabbos morning because they're not allowed to receive payment for Shabbos things? The answer is no, because there's no problem there. According to the Noda B'Yehuda, there's no problem because the only prohibition is for a service that's rendered. Here, this isn't service rendered. It's me giving payment or receiving payment for a product or for an item. As such, probably no problem keeping your website on in that case. What about lifnei iver? What about putting a stumbling block in front of the blind? Well, there are several considerations to say that there's no problem of lifnei iver here as well. It's lifnei iver is only if it's a definite outcome that somebody's going to transgress Shabbos. Is it a definite outcome that a Jew is going to access my website and purchase my gefilte fish? Is that a definite outcome? No, so there's no lifnei iver. Another consideration is that I'm facilitating the Jew who would not be able to incur this transgression without me. Well, no matter what the product is, with the exception of perhaps gefilte fish, if I'm selling cameras, if I'm selling books, there is another merchant online somewhere who's selling the same product that they could easily find. There's no shortage of competition on the internet. I have to compete with Amazon. I have to compete with any number of other online merchants. Because it's very easy for this non-religious Jew to transgress the Shabbos without me, I'm not transgressing lifnei iver by having my website operational because because they could very easily transgress this prohibition even without me. My help is not facilitating it. They could be and probably would be doing it even without me.
If you're selling something totally unique to you.
That's what I said about the gefilte fish.
Like you're selling your own shirim on.
Yeah, that would probably be a problem. Granted, yes, that might be a lifnei iver. Then you have the other consideration about it's possible that it's only for a definite lifnei iver. It's not a definite. They're not definitely going to access my shiurim on Shabbos. Another is that Another is that it has to be done that I have to be my action and their action have to be concurrent. I've set up the website before Shabbos. It's not being set up on Shabbos. So therefore, there's the leaf neiver is also minimized in that case. There are many reasons to say that leaf neiver is not a consideration here. Marasign appearances. Everybody knows that computers are automated. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, you turned on the computer specifically on Shabbos just so that I would so that Jews would transgress the Shabbos." That's not happening. Everybody knows that computers are on all the time, and you can access my all my classes go onto YouTube. They're always available. Everyone knows that that it's all automated. It's not being put into place specifically on Shabbos for Shabbos by me personally. It's all being done. It's all being done by computer. I'm not pushing a button allowing people to access it anytime that they click on it. Therefore, there's no like appearances or Maris Ayin that it looks like I'm trying to cause, giving people the wrong impression about it all. It's an automated system. The only consideration is Zilzul Shabbos, which is what we were mentioning before, and that is that you're degrading the Shabbos. Rav Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion that timers are never permitted, with the exception of lights. You can never use a timer for any purpose. Why? He said, well, because you can create a factory, you can have an entire business, you can have anything you want to do on Shabbos, operate and work on a timer. Completely, again, abrogating Shabbos observance. You can have the television on a timer, you can have your radio on a timer, you can have everything that you ever wanted to do on a timer, he says, and you completely ruin the Shabbos experience. So Moshe Feinstein said you can't use timers on Shabbos with the exception of lights. And he had a specific reason why lights are different. So perhaps according to that rationale, we'd say that maybe you'd have to turn off the website. You have to turn it off on Shabbos because of the degradation of Shabbos, especially if people are going to purchase things. According to Moshe Feinstein, perhaps this would be a degradation of the covet of Shabbos. Now, in general, our practice is not like Moshe Feinstein. We do rely on them. We do rely on timers. And it is a matter of great discussion amongst halachic authorities. It's very difficult to tell somebody that they have to turn off their computer on Shabbos. If their server, whatever it is, they have to turn off their online marketplace on Shabbos. It's very difficult to tell people to do that. There are some halachic authorities who say that you do. I think most say that you don't. If this is something that you're challenged with, again, come and speak to me personally, and we'll talk it through.
Is it the time zone? Is it like your Shabbos, or where it's Shabbos anywhere in the world? Because some Jew could be using it where it's Shabbos for them and not Shabbos.
That's an interesting question. It's an interesting question.
48 hours of Shabbos
Yes.
somewhere.
Where is it important? It's important if it's Shabbos where I am. The only thing that really seems to matter, according to most local authorities, is that if it's Shabbos where I am, then it's forbidden. But if it's Shabbos somewhere else, but it's not Shabbos where by me, I might have to be worried about if I'm calling up my uncle and my uncle's not an observant Jew, then I'm perhaps placing a stumbling block for him.
Gramophone.
Maybe a gramophone, yeah.
So like whatever. I'm trying to go back ancient times. I own a water mill or something. It's basically it's in public and people have to come and use it to mill their grain or to do their.
There's a lot of discussion
to basically disable the water mill on Shabbat is basically the same.
So there are rabbinic reasons in that case, yes, primarily because those machines were so loud and people would come to erroneous conclusions. The Maris Ayin consideration comes up in those places.
Quiet water.
You have a quiet water mill. It gets a little bit more complicated.
Yes.
That really is it's
inside a building, so it's not public. Do I have to turn it off or I guess lock the doors?
So if you set it up before Shabbos and you're not adding to it on Shabbos, then the answer is no.
Basically the same as the.
Yeah, here's a little bit different because you have Jews accessing it on Shabbos.
Let's say I have non-Jews that could be using it on Shabbos.
Yes, that was one of the things we said. There's no definite. It's not definitely so that it's.
This comes out to the factory. Automated factory.
Yeah.
Right? So I basically have an automated factory. It's doing whatever.
Yeah. So So
Yeah.
it's a complicated question, and thankfully, we don't live in Israel where we have a lot of Jewish industry, where these questions come up all that often. For us, it's very easy to just say no and shut the door on it. The rabbis in Israel deal with this frequently, and the answer is, and they have to grapple with people's parnasa, with with the economy of the country, the needs of society. There is a lot more to the question, specifically places like Israel, than is here for us. It's not as pressing as pressing as I think most rabbis will tell you to yeah, turn your factory off unless you engage in some kind of business relationship with a non-Jew.
Now you have all these sort of influencers, everybody, everything is permanently online. You're getting paid for clicks, right?
Yeah.
So I imagine in some ways it actually raises some new problems.
Well, I have to deal with this. I have a YouTube channel that has all my classes. So I will, first of all, it's not my YouTube channel. It's YouTube's channel that I'm providing. I'm just giving content to. But I do have to rely on a lot of these considerations, and that not definite that a Jew's going to access it. I'm not necessarily, everybody knows that it's automated and I had nothing to do with it. I'm not sitting there pushing the button, allowing them access anytime they want to access the class. It's done automatically. All these considerations that we've been discussing about websites do apply to me, and they do apply to YouTube.
It make for an interesting class to the halacha of Instagram.
Yeah. I'm too old for Instagram. I still have never used Instagram.
I switched over to
Oh, do you use Instagram instead of what? Really? I have no idea how it works. But I have to turn off Facebook these days, though.
That's why.
There's too much sexual content. It's insane. All right. Anyways, any questions, comments, or rebuttals? By all means, those of you at home,